What's going on? Jake here with Uncommon EDC, checking out the Microtech Standard Issue, also known as the MSI. And I really wanted to check this out for that Ram-Lok, which is on a couple models of Microtech, but they were pretty hard to get. And so I picked this up at Blade Show. They had plenty of them available. And this model is going to run $365, which isn't exactly cheap, but you are getting a premium still. It's overbuilt like all Microtechs are. You have this T20 pivot, T8 body, and clip screws, and it's made in America. And so it's pretty in line with Microtech pricing. I didn't have, it's almost a $400 knife. It didn't feel like an immediate sticker shock or anything like that at that price point, but it's definitely not a cheap one. With that said, they are coming out with a budget version of this knife, and so I haven't been following along that closely, honestly, because I already have this one, but a lot of what retailers already have it listed on their site for a price point of $175 to $190, depending on the blade configuration, which is available in this full plain edge, a partially serrated and a fully serrated version. Obviously went with the plain edge. But $175 to $190, you're getting the same exact steel and overbuilt quality made in America. The only difference is instead of G10, you're getting an injection molded polymer, which is going to feel a little more plasticky, probably going to have some flex where this really doesn't. And so that's kind of the trade-off you're getting, but for almost $200 cheaper, that's probably a pretty worthy trade-off in my opinion. But with that said, have had a little bit of a roller coaster with this knife. Kind of was excited about checking out the Ram-Lok, and then went to, 2 days after Blade Show when I was recording that haul video, was a little bit underwhelmed and feeling a little bit of buyer's remorse. The action on mine didn't feel as good as the one I handled at the show, and it's not the flashiest looking knife. Was feeling like maybe I could have spent my money better elsewhere, but that kind of bounced back. It definitely broke in, with axis locks, or in this case that Ram-Lok, there's always this kind of break-in period, and this was no exception. I think it broke in pretty nicely, and the action's pretty smooth on it now. And there's a lot of things that I really like about the knife. There's a couple things that I don't as well, and so I'll definitely get into that. But let's start with the specs. We have G10 handles. I think there were 3 colors available. There's also a frag pattern version available now, and so a few different colors, but G10 on the handles. You have a Bohler M390 MK blade, which is a Microtech proprietary blade steel. So they took Bohler M390 and they altered something about it. I don't know exactly what, either the composition of the steel, maybe the heat treat, something to make it proprietary, but have heard it's pretty comparable in side-by-side testing with regular Bohler M390. Haven't tested it myself though, in that capacity at least. And so you have a sheep's foot style blade. Really love the blade shape on this. Microtechs stonewash, which looks really good, hides imperfections really well. I like their stonewash quite a bit. Has a partial flat grind that kind of goes a little more than halfway up. Doesn't meet this back swedge. It's a pretty thick blade stock at 0.15 inches, so really appreciate that they have a full length swedge on the spine of that knife, but would have preferred if that flat grind went all the way up, or even if it was a hollow grind. But that's being pretty nitpicky, because overall I've been really happy with the performance of the blade, just in terms of cutting, as well as the edge retention. Both have really exceeded my expectations, and so that's being pretty nitpicky when I actually like how the knife itself performs, but something worth noting, I guess. It is a 3.85 inch blade. You have a pretty large sharpening choil on here, so that brings the cutting edge all the way down to 3.35 inches, but that also means that you can choke up. You use that as a finger choil, and there's nothing to keep you from sliding up on that blade, but I really haven't had any issues between the spot of my thumb where I'm really locked in and kind of pulling backwards on my finger. Really have had no issues whatsoever, so have been using that pretty confidently with no issue. I do like the jimping on it quite a bit. It's one of those thicker, more aggressive jimpings that I really like, more so than that kind of small, tight jimping that's really not always as effective at locking your thumb in. This one does a pretty good job of that. The handle itself is 5.05 inches, so plenty of real estate for a full 4-finger grip. And when I choke up, even more than that, you have maybe 1.5 inches to spare there. And so even the largest hand should have no issues with that grip. Overall length, we're looking at 8.9 inches, and the weight's a little bit on the heavier side, but don't hate it for the size of this knife. It's 5.29 ounces, and you get a nice lanyard hole here. It's pretty large size, so you can fit paracord and stuff in there. Sometimes you get these really tight ones that you really can't. You can put like skinnier cord or leather cords in there, but not paracord. This one's nice and large if you're someone who likes to put lanyards on. Reversible tip-up pocket clip, nice deep carry, and you can see it comes with an inlay in here to delete that gap. The screws are not countersunk, but they are T8, just like the rest of the body screws, and that pivot I already mentioned is a T20. Pocket clip's pretty good, like I said, nice and deep carry. You have the Ram-Lok here, and it looks like an axis lock, but functions a little bit differently. There are some Benchmades that function similarly, but most bar locks or crossbar locks, axis locks, whatever the company calls them, use something that's an omega spring. This one uses a coiled spring on a plunger, so it's a little bit more similar to a shark lock, except you use it more like an axis lock. But the switch itself on here, I really like it. It has that same X that you see on there out the front. Easy to grip, and unlike an axis lock, you can use one side at a time, and that works pretty well for me. And so, like I said, the action's a lot better on this. Been pretty happy with that overall. Still, every once in a while I'll fail it. It's not the best in my collection, so you can see I failed it there. Not the best in my collection, but pretty good. Do like that they kept the billboarding pretty minimal. You have the claw here, there are talons here with the M390 MK, but nothing on that back side, and all of the rest of the branding is on the pocket clip itself. So you have MSI, the serial number, which in this case is 090, and the date it was made, or the month at least, which is May 2023, and then you have the Microtech logo. So already mentioned that I'm really happy with the blade. I love pretty much everything about it. I can nitpick and find things that I don't like, but I'm really happy with the blade. All of the kind of things that I'm not so happy with happen in the handle or the lock area. And so there's some common hot spots that a lot of people have mentioned. There's really 3 that are pretty prominent, and I have experienced 2 of the 3. One doesn't really affect me. And so I'm going to mention all 3 because I've heard it enough that I think it's pretty common. But the first one being the pocket clip itself, and this just sticks up a little bit too far. Maybe a millimeter, if they dialed it back, would eliminate that hot spot, or maybe if they reduce the angle that is sticking up, and that might eliminate the hot spot. But both the hot spots that I experience present themselves pretty differently. This one's almost immediate. I feel it, it's a light annoyance. It doesn't really ever get worse for me though. So I think some people, as they use it more, it gets a lot worse. For me, it kind of has just stayed a minor annoyance that I'm aware of, but isn't super painful. It's not a real hot spot for me, but I'm also very aware of it. So that's a pretty common one. I think if they dialed it back, they can get rid of that. Another one is this jimping on the back of the handle, and that one doesn't really affect me. My pinky does sit on it when I'm back here, and not super painful. It doesn't really create a hot spot. When I choke up, my pinky actually gets all the way off of it, and so that really hasn't been an issue. However, both grip positions, I experienced this third one, and that's this point right here where it curves from the finger access up the handle. It's just a little bit of a hot spot that I don't really notice in light use, and so initially it's fine, but the more and more I use the knife, after just a minute or 2, it starts becoming a hot spot, and it gets progressively worse. It's by far the worst of all of them for me. I've heard of people actually shaving this back a little bit, grinding it down, and not helping. And I don't know that I'm ready to take that plunge yet. But for me, if I'm going to be doing heavy using this knife, gloves seem to do the trick. I'm fine with gloves, and that hot spot kind of goes away for me for the most part. And so not the hugest deal in the world, but it is a real hot spot that develops after just a couple minutes for me. And so that's the only one that I think is kind of a major one for me, but everyone's hands are different. I've heard a lot more people complain about the pocket clip one than that one. So that may be a non-issue for you, depending on your hand shape. Now, the other one is one that I'm still on the fence if I even care about, to be honest. And so I was talking to someone else about, how do you like your MSI? And they said, for the most part, they're liking it. They mentioned some of the same hot spots, but they asked if I had seen a video by, I believe it was the Pointy End here on YouTube. And I hadn't, so I checked it out, and he did a spine whack test on it, and the lock failed. And so I kind of skipped that whole thing with button locks. You know, there was a huge thing a few months ago with button locks, a lot of people spine whacking them. I really didn't get into it because the way I'm using knives, there wasn't any way that I was using a knife that was really imitating a spine whack. I'm not batoning with folding knives. I'm not, you know, hitting the back of it all that often. And so I could come up with imaginary scenarios where I turn and hit the counter and it possibly fails, but that's going to be so unlikely that I can come up with more likely scenarios. And so I never really cared about it. It didn't affect my buying decision when I thought about button locks. And so I wasn't even sure if I should bother testing this one, but there was this 10-pound neoprene coated weight that my wife had sitting on the floor nearby, and so I figured, hey, why not? I'm gonna slap it on there, see what happens. And I didn't go that hard. You know, I held it like this, didn't have a great grip on it, and so didn't want it going flying out of my hands, but also didn't want it to close on my hands, and mostly just dropped it with gravity, a little bit of wrist flick, but pretty light. I can't do it here because this table is glass, so there's just a layer of vinyl over it and it would break the glass, but just kind of let the gravity do most of the work, a little bit of wrist in there, and it failed. And so I pulled out my cell phone, recorded a short video. I may clip that in here. But tested it 3 more times in a row, 3 more times in a row, it failed. And so, like I said with the button lock, I don't know how much I care about that, but I do know that it failed. And now that I tested it, feeling the little amount of pressure that it took to fail it, I did lose a little bit of confidence in the lock that otherwise has performed exceedingly well. There's no play whatsoever. It locks up well, have had no failures whatsoever. But in the back of my mind, I remember how much pressure it took, which wasn't much. And it did cause me to lose just a little bit of confidence in this lock. I think with time, that's just gonna go away, just using the knife, but something worth mentioning, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Is that something where it's an immediate non-buy? And especially at this price point, $365 it might be, but would love to hear more people's thoughts on that. But for me, I think it's still kind of not a major issue, but something I did wanna make people aware of since I tested it and had the same results. It wasn't a fluke in his video. But otherwise, would love to hear what you think about this knife. At the price point, I don't know that I'd buy it again, but if I didn't have one, even knowing what I know now, I'd still probably check out the budget version. I think $175 for what you're getting. It's a pretty good knife, and if you can get past those, you know, kind of minor things, and if the spine whack test isn't a deal breaker for you, I think $175 is actually a really good deal for these, but don't know that I'd pay $365 for one again. But would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. As always, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification button if you enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a great one. Take care.